the project The Price of the State, which it's a project which is not that serious, but it was created attached to the serious research center. Here, during the panel discussion, there will be some majority of these representatives of this research institute will be here. But when we have some free time, we deal with the enlightenment and educational activities. We share the ideas of free trade, free market, translating and voice-overing and dubbing the reels about the economic freedom. My name is Yevhen Shulga. I'm the director of the project The Price of the State. Now to the serious part. This is the map, which was here more than half of the day on the screen. It has a very important peculiarity. The countries which are red are almost always in the southern part of Earth, and Europe has the only red spot. This red spot is Ukraine. Ukraine is the worst as the economic freedoms among all of the rest European countries, according to the data of the Fraser Institute. Fraser Institute holds not only quantitative comparison, but also the projects which need to define the reasons and ways out of the situation for the countries which have some problems with the economic freedoms. The Fraser Institute gave us the case of Ukraine and the Bendukidze Center, a certain methodology, according to which for a year or something we tried to get to know how and what limits economic freedoms in Ukraine, and we tried this knowledge to be systematized and to make certain conclusions. This is what we'll present today in this discussion. The professionals who took part in it, who created reports about the separate components of this economic freedom indicator, will speak about the size of the state, about the sound money, about the labor market and its limitations, about law enforcement system, how we created this research. In the comparison of all of the other expert discussions where we can have state officials, journalists, civil society and businessmen, and everybody is speaking, we decided to ask the businessmen only, because we consider that economic freedom is the category which is dealt with, first of all, by the businessmen, and all of the rest participants of those processes are secondary. So we gathered the most respectful businessmen of this country 2 hours ago. There was a speech about the ranking of the most respectful businessmen after our research was published, but we were surprised, and it was pleasant for us to see at least 1/3 of the people who took part in our discussions. Those were owners of the big enterprises and the businessmen of a very high level. We had representatives from the investment banks, the high technology companies, property and auditors of the Big Four and Big Ten. Those are owners and board of those enterprises, which told their remarks and told about their own experience of limitations of economic freedoms from the state. Those discussions were according to the rules of Chatham House. We are not saying about the names of the participants of those discussions, but we will use their quotes in today's speeches. And I think that now I can give the floor to... Well, so far we don't have Denis Brodskiy here, so I'll just introduce everyone one by one, not to forget everyone. So this is Dmytro Boyarchuk. He's an executive director of the case of Ukraine. He will devote his speech to one of the 4 components of our research, which deals with the size of the state. I think Dmytro will tell more about that and better. Thank you. Could you please turn on my presentation? Maybe I won't tell more about the research. My presentation is devoted to the attempt to be sure that we are paying too much for the services of the state. In the end, I used several quotes of the people who had speeches at our meetings. I think that they will approve those ideas. I will begin with a standard chart which all of you had seen already. The size of the state is being measured by how the redistributed GDP is from the budget. This chart should show that we are kind of a European country. We are in the respectful company of Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and if we'd like to become Denmark, we would have to grow our expenses, right? This is if we look at the overall picture. But if we look at the quality of the services we're getting for the money the state takes from us, the picture is a bit different. I decided to superimpose the index, worldwide governance indicators. They have several indices which show how efficient the state works. So surprisingly, we are in the company of the countries which spend approximately the same as for the percentage of GDP like we are, but the quality of their services, this point down there in the minus, is the quality of our services. That's the quality of the regulations. How much people who live in Ukraine, they evaluate in a quality way the quality of regulations for themselves. So what do we have with rule of law? How much, for instance, the services of the courts are correspondent, and you can see almost the same situation. It seems to me that we are paying rather a substantial amount, knowing the amount of our salaries and wages, but still the situation with the rule of law is not that good. And the third indicator which I chosen was the quality of the public administration. So how the public services and communication with state officials, and still the situation is the same. It doesn't change. We're still paying substantial way, but we're getting nothing at all. What else can I say about our country? It was interesting for us how many and which role in our life, in the life of our society, the state takes, and we counted how many people in this or that way depend on the state. Either in the profits way, the work way, or some support or payments and help. This is the shortened infographics. The full infographics is at our webpage, but there are lots of figures there. So it turns out that approximately 2/3 of the population of Ukraine are in this or that way. They can't be considered free people. Only 1/3 sometimes feel the presence of our state. Those are interesting facts. Every third person works for the state, either state enterprises or some state service or just the budget official. More than half of the population are the participants of the state social programs. More than a half. Any of the subsidies are about 40% of the profits of the population. I am not considering the pensions and the salaries the people are getting in the state institutions, on the budget officials in any way. So there is a substantial influence of the state in our life. What the state is, the state enterprises, the enterprises which, as if they belong to the people. Well, at least that's what they say from the TV. They are not transparent at all, in fact. And the interesting thing is that finally we had the law which obliges them to report in the system of e-data. They need to give the information about their accountability, about their operations and transactions. Out of 3,600, almost not a single one registered there, even didn't register there. These are the figures we saw there, those which registered there, and they never post anything there. They never give the information there. The situation is really bad. We wrote certain requests and went to court, but they consider it's not their obligation even in the courts. This is how the state looks like. The state enterprises is too many here. This is the data of OECD. Those are not our calculations. This infographics was overdriven by the internet when the people saw how many state enterprises we have. We had a fair reproach that, first of all, in Canada, it's not zero of state enterprises, but we're speaking about the enterprises which belong to the central government. And those which we name, which belong to the local communities, that is subnational governments, in our understanding, those are communal or public utility enterprises. Really, there are lots of them. And the second one, people said, don't look at the quantity, look at their volume. Well, yes, it's logical, I do agree. But we need to understand that all of those 3,600 enterprises need to be controlled. How can you govern the quantity of the enterprises, which is 3,600 units? This is our accountability. This is their agreement in the financial plans. And the Ministry of Economy and the Foundation of State Property, they sometimes can deal with several dozens. But still, maybe you heard those stories with Naftogaz and all the rest. All the rest is what I mean. They just kind of orphans. Nobody knows about them anything. They don't have the information. This is how our state looks like. What else about the state? If we take the state plus the monopoly, then we get a very interesting mix, a super scheme. This is not like the state controls the business or the business cooperates with the state somehow. They just try to mix up the power and the capital. I think that you've heard about this scheme Rotterdam Plus, which is actively working. So during those meetings, there were very interesting quotes of the participants, which I'd like to mention, telling what the state is and why it's so expensive for us. The state is overblowing the expenses. One of the participants is the businessman, a very famous one. He tried to become a representative of the authority, and he was inspired by the opportunity to change something. And his first impression was, I've never seen so much money in my life. I've never seen so much money which the state corridors have as a turnover. I've never seen such an amount of money. The usage of this money is totally inefficient. Kiev Council adopts the expenses, for instance, for Kiev automobile road services, 200 million, they say. He shows, show me the calculations, why? And after the question, they say, okay, let it be 100 million. And you can see that people were trying, of course, they did have the precise plan, because they can just make the price reduced twice. Those are the impressions of this person. The state is, I'd say, a structure which generates the projects where to steal more. When you have some money and you want to build something for yourself, maybe you will still weigh whether it's worth to do it or not and how to do that. But in the state corridors, there is an idea. As soon as we get money, they try to use them. This is the strange term which says, once one state official told me, give us a nice budget and we will just use it. And again, the impression which is shared by one of the entrepreneurs, that Kiev Council decided to waste 800 million for the informatization. The first feedback, this sum of money is bigger than was invested to all of the projects online, you know, OLX, Rosetka and Modnacast. And he asks, why? And they say, we need our own data storage and we need our own separate line. But why can't you use cloud? Cloud is not reliable, they say. It's not... Well, still the separate line is not defended too enough, so somebody can get in and steal. So still they use this money, and Sometimes it looks very rationally, but still I'm sure that according to the statistical accounting, it was like investment and high technologies. Those are the stories. And the state is too expensive for us. One of the businessmen shares his impressions. He counts how much it costs for him to have the office. For instance, for one person or for one unit, he took Kiev, he took Moscow, Amsterdam, several countries, and he says that Kiev and Moscow are similar as for the price, and they're the most expensive. Though we say that the labor force is the cheapest, in the United States the labor force is more expensive, all the rest is... but all those bribes and all those additional expenses they have because of the security service, tax service and so on, they all compensate it. And his conclusion was, his personal figures were that to have business in Ukraine is too expensive. You're asking why the investors don't come to Ukraine? Because the state costs too much here. Not only what the state gathers and how efficient it wastes, but which external expenses they have because of the activities of the state. And also the last thesis, you always owe to your state. You can always hear that from the high cabinets, that the state is the partner of the business. What the hell? To make business in Ukraine, you need to have friendship here. If the businessman is mistaken, he'll be fined. If he has some of the problems, if the state official has some of the mistakes, he won't get any sanctions. Those are not partnership relations. So if you didn't have proper friends in different offices, maybe a business won't be as active as it should be. Those were the feedback from the businessman. And now what I wanted to tell you, that the state in our situation has to be less. Maybe if it were more efficient, we could say that Denmark or like Sweden, but for the quality we get, we should definitely pay less. It isn't worth it. So we need to decrease the expenses of any distribution and redistribution of GDP through the budget, because in fact there's no sense for the normal economy. The enterprises need to be sold, maximum sold, because there will be the report and you will see lots of other stories and happy endings. I couldn't see any happy endings with the state enterprises. To sell them or to liquidate, the private initiative has to substitute the state one whenever it's possible. Of course, we're saying about a very utopia scenario, but still, the medical institutions and educational institutions can provide those services if we provide the system that the money are coming for the children, for the student. So why this money can be earned by the private medical institutions, even the social security and the project of Brodskiy Жизнелюб, the level of life. It's a private project about the pensioners' more active, proactive life. The state can still interfere into the military sphere and the legislation sphere, and we have to invest a lot into that, because for today it's much more interesting to use the institutions of different countries. Stockholm Court, High Court of London, Ukrainian Court, just to use institutions of Ukraine. Nobody wants to do that. In fact, the UK created the institute which exports the services all over the world. They have the proper trust and the high quality of verdicts. Even if you are an evil Yanukovych, but you have the property rights, they will refuse. They will say it's the property right if you don't have any proof. That's why they go there. And for us, the quality of those institutions is working totally differently. So these are the standards and minimization and depersonification and e-governance and a very harsh civil control, because the state itself has the tendency for spreading, widely spreading, which is too wide. Thank you, that's it. Thanks, it's very pleasant to hear the applause for our work. I give the floor to Volodymyr Dubrovskiy, who is the senior economist of Case Ukraine, and his topic is the stable money system, that is sound money. Because if we think that the access to the money and the inflation is the tax, which is taken away in a hidden way. Unfortunately, the microphone is off. Thank you. In English, it's named sound money, so this term can be translated as reliable money or something. Or we could make it broader, as Yevgen has just done it, so all of us know that we've got a big problem with that, really. In the ranking of economic freedom, it is reflected like that the top 10 of the best countries, they naturally have the ranking close to 10 points, which is the maximum of what's possible. But the average world ranking doesn't lag behind. The EU countries are on the best level. Still, the post-communist countries, as you can see, they are mostly better than an average in the world. They're coming close to the EU countries. Such countries as Poland is even on the level of EU, and even Russia is higher than average level. And suddenly Ukraine, 3 on scale from 1 to 10. So why is that? Because first of all, we're having a temporary effect of the 2015 and 14. We had a very great rate of inflation, and as the ranking was calculated according to the data which were accessible at those days, it was 2015, then Ukraine got such a low estimation. But this is not the only indicator why Ukraine lags behind. We're having the situation, and we know that hryvnia is not reliable currency. Still, we have a very strict restriction to the more reliable money. The indicator according to which Ukraine still got the 0 points is the access to foreign currency and the possibility to have money in foreign currency. So why is hryvnia so soft? All of us know that it's devaluated 15 times for 20 years, that the inflation is mostly was 2 digits, and only for 8 years it was fewer than 10%, but it was close to this indicator. Still, it has certain expectations which sometimes are weighted by people. If people are waiting for inflations and waiting for devaluation, macroeconomics knows that then it eventually really happen. It's very difficult to overcome those expectations, and those regulation restrictions the government has to make people use hryvnia in spite of its being weak, and people would like to use the more reliable currency, they still the authority of this currency. They give birth to such kind of behavior of not giving the foreign currency abroad, and it weakens hryvnia again. So when we are saying about regulatory restrictions which are introduced to keep the currency rate, yes, they do that, but only for a certain time. But for the long-term things, unfortunately, are substituted for short terms, and long-term things are trust, for instance. This chart shows that, in fact, if we're speaking about devaluation as the biggest and the most obvious weakness of hryvnia, you can see, it's very obvious that you can see that the government was the reason of the most ruining crisis. The crisis of 1996, I'm not even speaking about 1993, that was a disaster totally, but we didn't have hryvnia at those times. So it was because of the loans given to the local producers. Still, the crisis of 1998, it was caused by the government which took loans without any responsibility, and at the expense of those money coming, decided to keep the same rank, the same rate of the currency rate. But it's the kind of the house of cards, because if something is being ruined, all of the rest will be ruined too. It doesn't only make the devaluation deeper, but it becomes jumping. So the hryvnia devaluated 3 times because of this pyramid being built. And the same pyramid was built by the government of Azarov Yanukovych. And who else was the head of National Bank? Arbuzov left, it seems to me. I don't remember, honestly speaking. In 2013. And then we understood that devaluation is inevitable not only up to 10 or 11, how it used to be, but there will be devaluation which we saw 3-digit ones. But the only crisis which was caused mostly by the market factors in 2008, it was the world disaster, Lehman Brothers and so on. It also brought the ruining currency crisis for 60%. Devaluation was for 60%. You can see that the government is the main, in this case, factor of non-stability of hryvnia. What are the fundamental reasons? Because the money is always the reflection of something. When I was taught business consulting, they said that if the firm has some financial problems, yes, they have the problems, but we need to deepen to understand what the real problems are. So if the state has some problems with the finances, it is the result of paternalism and immaturity of the society. It's the consequence that we are having mostly the raw materials expert. We have the low level of trust with the state and state institutions, including monetary ones, and the concentrations of markets, including credit market and all of the other markets, which makes our country much more vulnerable for any monetary shock. Paternalism and immaturity give birth to the populism, which was mentioned by Dmytro just, that so many people are living independence of the country is the consequence of this kind of populism. On the other hand, the raw material expert means that these goods which are being exported by Ukraine, they are constantly vulnerable for the world because the prices, they really are not stable. If you have the raw materials experts, the best practice is to get some funds which store some money during and which are used when there is the decrease of the prices. But the bad practice, like Venezuela and Ecuador, is to spend all of the money for the social expenses, which are very difficult to cut. But when the prices go down, to give loans. This is how the countries get into the debt, trap. So the state is totally spending much more than it can gain. So together with the lack of the trust towards the state institutions and the great concentration of the market, the country becomes vulnerable for the inflation. That's why we have the 2-digit inflation, a digit inflation all the time, and such a vague. It has the disbalance of the world trade, because when the prices go down, people go on consuming the same level of energy, and we have the big gap in the balance, which is covered by some currency, which are very unstable. And the government then takes loans, and then they need to give back those loans. And then you need to buy this currency, and it all leads us to devaluation, because when the country has inflation, the goods lose their competitiveness, both in the external and internal markets, and sooner or later there should be a correction. When it's more expensive to live and to buy something in the shop than in Poland, Hungary or Slovakia, then it's the sign that something is going wrong. It shouldn't be like that, and something should change. Sooner or later, it will end with devaluation. But if this devaluation would be flexible, or it won't be that ruining. But the government tries just to calm down the people to keep the currency rate. Then we are having it piled up, piled up, piled up, and the earthquake, which you could see at the previous chart. This is the most ruining situation for the economy of the country. And just to prevent financial crisis, and during the financial crisis you're having very big, hard restrictions, which are taken for a long time. We had certain limitations even for usage of the personal accounts. So again, it breaks the trust. It ruins the trust to the national currency. It helps the concentration of markets and monopolization, because some of the people who have friends can avoid those restrictions and someone can't. So this is what we have. Moreover, we're having very expensive money. The access to the money, the access to the financing, funding, is one of the biggest obstacles for the development of the business. One of the reasons is the inflation expectations. When the entrepreneurs are saying we want credits with 5% loans, the first question is, are you ready to put the money for 5% deposit? Of course not. I'll have to restrict you because of the time limits. You're having 2 or 3 minutes more. So yes, we have the budget deficit and the weak property rights and domination of the state and oligarch banks, which gather money for a certain financial industrial group. So weak property rights and devaluation and inflation expectations make those risks very high. When the risks are very high, the rates can't be low. So the budget deficit makes the state borrow the money, and that means that it gives the banks the tool, which is better than the real sector. It's easier for them to invest into state obligations than to credit to the real sector. So it competes with the private borrowers. This is the effect of crowding out. And finally, when we're having the credits, they're still those loans are still distributed very irregularly, because sometimes they just have the lack of the money. All of that leads to the high rates. That's what we were told about the reasons by the participants of our meetings. They had complaints that the assets in Ukraine, even the liquid ones and reliable assets like the real estate, which is considered all over the world to be reliable, they are not considered to be, even real estate can't be considered to be reliable at all, because it can be stolen. And sometimes they say that yes, we have money, but not all of the people have access to it. If you are politically painted into the proper colors, if you have the access to the state banks, then you have money. If you don't have it. So the conclusions are... The main conclusion was really very well formulated by one of the participants of the meetings. It's the country risk in the scientific language. So the access to the financing is limited by the fact that we're living in Ukraine. And the trade balance, which I mentioned above, if we were not able to regulate the situation in this or that way with the monopolization of export and with the raw material export, and just to give an opportunity, well, thanks God now they began a more or less transparent VAT reimbursement, which will allow the export. But still, before that, there was a great obstacle for the development of any export. And the first reason was that we don't have enough of the property rates, both for those who gave the loan and for those who had something in mortgage, because it can be stolen by raiders, and about the property rights of the common people who are having their money in the banks, because their rights to maintain their money can be restricted in any moment. So my first recommendation is to fix it in the constitutional level. The deposit is something you gave as a credit, but all of that is just unconstitutionality. If you're having money, you need this money to be used totally free manner, and then this money will be much more reliable, and they will lead to the increase of the level of trust. And also, you have to fix the fiscal rights, how it was done in Georgia in the Act of Economic Freedom, which just restrict the opportunity of the government to lead the irresponsible policy and to broaden the state, what was mentioned by Dmytro. If it is done at this level, then we do hope that it would be much easier to keep the state from the storage of budget deficits, from the broadening of the budget and all of the funds which are redistributed by the state. The state banks have to be privatized as any other enterprise, and the control over the reliability of the banks needs to be provided by the third-party monitoring. It should be transparent, at least for the IMF, for instance, or for some Basel institutions. Because just to give it to our National Bank of Ukraine, unfortunately, is very risky, and it will lead to the situation when we have the whole accumulation of bad banks and then they just vanish. So if the situation goes on like it used to go on in 2014 and 15, maybe we will have to come to the painful events and measures, for instance, have a regimen which restrict the freedom of monetary policy of the state. The more freedom the state has, the less freedom the people have. So if the state will show again that it's not able to cope with the irresponsibility of monetary policy which ruins the money, then maybe the less evil will be the implementation of the currency council, so-called, or something like that. Once in the beginning of 2014, this is the last sentence, after the Revolution of Dignity, we had a summit in Ukraine where lots of nice guests came, including Bendukidze, late Bendukidze, and he then said that Ukraine needs urgently to introduce the currency council, that is, to cancel the right of the National Bank to print the money and to own their own currency unit and to have the independent currency policy. I counted very quickly and I said, calculated, with knowing the reserves, it will be the course of 16 or 18 currency rate. And he says, if you don't do that, it will become worse. In March 2014, the currency rate of 18 seemed to be awful. Well, maybe Kacha was right. Thank you. Thank you, Volodymyr. I'm giving the floor to Denis. I'm sorry. Okay, the floor is taken by Volodymyr Fedoryn. Yeah, he can do that because he's the host here. No, I'm doing that not because I'm the host, but because my category is in front of the regulation of the labor. Well, the agenda is different. Yes, it's our mistake. Sorry, Evgen. So, I was sitting and thinking what I will tell you about, what my report will be about. It seems to me I know what it will be about. How this interesting and original mechanism of the crime power exists. I don't know such a popular phrase in any other country which is not post-Soviet country, but the phenomena of crime power is very regular with each new president. First of all, We are having some of the reforms, some of the attempts to do something, and later on everything is coming along the plot of the crime power with bad consequences. So it seems to me that the key to this phenomena of the crime power is in this block, the block of the law enforcement system. I don't want to speak about courts even now, because as all of us understand, to create a nice court is the question of dozens of years, if not centuries. But if the law enforcement does not the defense of the law, but the things which were mentioned by Dmytro when he showed the indicators of the quality of the public administration, the indicators of the quality of services, when the law enforcement system, the key part of the state, the key functions of the state is to defend the property rights. So instead of this defense, the system is working to attack, to ruin the property rights. We are getting then a very serious and constantly refunctioning cycle of spiral that's going down. Let's look at one of the indicators which is being used in the index of the Fraser Institute. That is the indicator which is taken from the World Competitiveness Index. That's the rating of the reliability of the work of law enforcement bodies and authorities. So here Ukraine is, in fact, almost in the end of this ranking. Not everything is so awful. We are not at the 158th place, how it used to be in the ranking of the 2017, according to the results of 2015, so 2.75. It's really bad. Who was present during the previous discussion panel? You saw it. It was the reputationally the cleanest, the most authoritative representatives of Ukrainian business. And as far as I know, 3 of the 4, I don't know the 4th, sorry, because I didn't ask him, and maybe he would add to this 4, and we would have the indicator of 100%, but 3 of the 4 during the recent 2 years had certain attacks from the security service of Ukraine. And the method Yevgen mentioned in the very beginning, when we concentrated to take out of the entrepreneur the most painful problems, the most substantial problems, not this usual laundry list, which is rather long always, but what's the key out of that? During the first meeting, this topic kept coming back. We even had a special meeting for that. The security service of Ukraine as a factor of non-security for Ukrainian business and Ukrainian economy. And it, in fact, is the phenomenon of the recent 2 years. This is how the law enforcement system mutates in the framework of the functioning of the criminal power. Because before 2013, the most dangerous, the harsh, and the most harmful for business and economy was such authority as the General Prosecutor's Office. But as at the first stage of the functioning of the criminal power, the Prosecutor Office had to be reformed and to cut the authorities and to take away the monitoring, so this system isn't used to have the vacuum. So the priority of the right how to ruin came to some other body. If the General Prosecutor's Office is an institutional descendant of the Empire Russia, then the Security Service of Ukraine is the descendant of the KGB and others of the Soviet Union. So which were the trends with the help of which the Security Service of Ukraine, which according to the law shouldn't do economic crimes, which loopholes could they find in the laws and other drafts which give an opportunity for the security service to find certain financial opportunities. The financing of the terrorism, well, this is one of the articles which we could name anytime. Having even a little imagination, we could say that our meeting has the certain signs of financing of the terrorism, right? There are dozens of examples when the business of totally various regions of Ukraine are gaining accusations. They're taking the documentation, they take the money, they take the material values, and then, as it's a commercial activity, the authorities are open for the further negotiations. The second loophole, as we have still a very sacred attitude towards the foreign currency, as we're still having the foreign currency restrictions, the security service has an authority to pose sanctions into all of the subjects of the external economic activities. So they just can stop or withdraw with the activities with the foreign enterprises. In 2016, in comparison with 2015, the quantity of those sanctions increased 6 with something times. And those are only the sanctions which were posed. Because there are some situations when sometimes you can react back, communicating with the representatives of the higher authority. The third loophole is their interpretation of the law about technical means of gaining information, private gaining of information. This is how they decided to interpret it. Now even the software can be considered like this, a technical means of illegal gaining of information. And Tomasz Fiala, who's used to be here, he's very successful in wide business. He invests a lot into social projects. In spring this year, he was in a very unpleasant situation because they came from the security service to his place and announced one of the programs, software programs he uses, a very special technical mean of private gaining of information. What's the mechanism and how does the system function of the dangerous for economy, for the state, for the society, law enforcement authorities? In fact, the next week we'll present the first draft of our report. I just looked at the chapter which concerns law enforcement bodies, and it's told there that two main motivations are the personal enrichment and the broadening of their influence in the bureaucracy pyramid, in the bureaucracy vertical. This chapter was written by me approximately 2.5 weeks ago, and now I understand that I need to add one more element there. The personal enrichment and this administrative rank seeking is possible only because our law enforcement authorities are the most useful mechanism in the framework of the functioning of this criminal power idea. So the license for robbing, the license for illegal broadening of your authorities gained by those bodies is only because they agree to perform illegal political orders from the current power. So the main features of the frauds are listed here, and violations also. So it's emphasized that they not only want to live well and to drive Porsches and Bentleys and other expensive cars, but their involvement into the uncontrolled power, uncontrolled by the society power, which is striving for the beginning of the next political cycle to accumulate out all of the money resources, human resources, media resources. And of course, the caste character of the law enforcement, which in fact it's the caste character of institutionalized and human dynasty, descendants of those structures as they used to be during the last dozens of years of the Soviet Union. So when we were communicating with the businessman, it was precisely mentioned that really the security service is the main problem. The General Prosecutor's Office, because of the reforms, is not opposing such a threat, which allowed us to which allowed the security service to be the first. And it's understandable that so-called law enforcement is using their authority, both legal and paralegal, only for rent-seeking, just to gain out of Ukraine economy and Ukrainian business as much money as possible. Thus, it's totally obvious that without the reforming process, or maybe without the full reboot or the creation from scratch, the new body of all of those descendants of Dzerzhinsky and other Secret Service representatives, it would be difficult for us to think that the key functions of the state will be in order. In fact, all of the measures are more or less obvious. The EU is saying about that because those are our obligations in front of our allies. Demilitarization, the total absence of counterintelligence, so-called one, the total reboot of the organizational structure, the full refusal of non-characteristic authority and jurisdictions, counterintelligence, terrorism, and defense of the constitutional regimen, and the cut of the numbers. Because now in the security service of Ukraine there are 30,000 people working. Not a single European country can have such a big counterintelligence service. And of course we have what to do with all of the rest law enforcement bodies, and the General Prosecutor's Office has to be cleaned up to the end, and the National Anti-Corruption Bureau. But summing up my short report, I still would like to emphasize that we are speaking about the reforms process, about the mechanisms of the functioning of our power. It's functioning for several political cycles already, so I think that without the change of the power at the elections, without the serious constitutional changes, we won't be able to take out the sting out of the people who don't perform the key functions. They still ruin this country, in fact, and whatever they say on the language of high patriotism, they are working for the external enemy, for the defeat of Ukraine. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you. Thank you. I'm giving the floor to Denis Brodskiy. He is one of the leading professionals in Ukraine as for the labor market, and one of the topics we've mentioned is our code of laws, which has to defend the rights of our workers since the Soviet times. Okay, of course it's my time because I'm the last one to speak in this panel discussion. I have a great piece of news. I don't have the presentation. You will still have to watch me and to listen to me. That's it. So the labor law, which is the topic which is not that often spoken about. It seems to me that we should do more about that. Maybe I'm thinking like that because I'm dealing with labor laws for 20 years, and this or that way facing it up to the High Court of Ukraine still. Before I tell you what, in our opinion, needs to be changed and how we should move, before I have there some historic understanding why it looks like that now. Our labor code, though the last one was adopted in the 70s of the last century, it was born in the 30s of the last century, and some of the professionals say that it never used to be a law document. It was a marketing paper which was used in the interests of the world expansion of the ideas of communism by the trade unions to show, you see, how much beautiful country we have. We defend our workers as much as possible. Maybe that is why it's one of the worst law documents in Ukraine. We don't have professional definitions there. All of the decrees of the High Court and the interpretations and so on, they take much more space than the labor code itself with all of its articles. All of them, or almost all of them, during the latest 20 years were just redefined, rewritten. That is why we're now having another attempt to change the labor code, to rewrite it, but only to make it in order from the law point of view. It doesn't have anything more. Even according to the plot, it will be the same obsolete, archaic document which defends the hegemony of the proletariat. So the biggest flaw of the labor code is the total inequality of the employer and the employee. And maybe it would sound paradox for you, but still this inequality leads to even more lack of defense of the employee. Not a single employer is not profitable for him to have a certain labor relationship. This is the last thing the person who has his own business to do, to have certain labor relationship, because he or she understands how unfree he or she becomes. So we will do whatever we can for those labor relationship to avoid them. So we're just pushing out our citizens having this iron concrete labor code to the zone of not working relationship, when the employee has no rights at all. Why do we have such a high level of salaries in the envelopes? It's not only because of the economic profit, but because of the fear to enter the work relationship. We were speaking to the lawyers and finances which deal with the investments into Ukraine. They accompany the projects of investments in Ukraine. They're saying the same. In 90% of the cases, Ukraine falls out of the short list of the countries which can have investments after the analysis of the labor code and labor laws. Let those be labor risks, let those bribes be, but still, to build the factory in the country where, according to the law, you won't be able to influence the quality and the efficiency of the law, of the labor, nobody will do that. 90% of the ideas of investments into Ukraine are over after the analysis of the law code. It has to be totally changed. The first thing, and that's why I'm meaning what I want to tell, what needs to be changed in the philosophy of the law code. The first, we have to find the subject of the contract. What I mean, if we are two free people, I'm the owner of the production means and the money, and I hire a person who is a free one to work, we can make a deal what the conditions will be and how this person will work. This is our sovereign right to make a deal. To make a deal how much I pay for which work, how I name this post, at what conditions you need to inform me that you want to retire, at what conditions I can fire you. This is the first thing that has to be compulsory, the right to make decisions. In the United States of America, for instance, it's enough to say, thank you, I'm not satisfied with your work, I don't want to pay anymore because this is my money. I have the right not to pay, but we have the contract. According to conditions, of which we can do that or not. This should be the main sign. If the people had a deal, let them give them the right to make decisions. But we have sometimes people who say, I don't want to work from 9 till 6 p.m. It would be much more profitable for me to work from 2 till 2 a.m. I want to work like that. No, you can't, because there are certain restrictions and so on. The last case I've heard about, and maybe lots of people know about that, when the employees are trying to harm the reputation of their company. When you saw the video reels when the people swam in the bigger vessels where the food production was prepared. It's impossible to fire these people because they didn't violate any rules. The expenses are million expenses, but you can't do anything. You can't fire. This is the main reason why the employer doesn't have the possibility to influence. Let's have the Q&A session later on. Yes, I had to fire a person for their inefficient work, but you can imagine how many efforts I had to spend. I had to come to the High Court to prove that I fired the person, that he or she didn't perform all of his obligations. I had to sign 150 million of instructions, so every day we had to catch this person to write the written order what he has to do for the day. Because without that, the court didn't want to take any documents. But why do we have to take this awful way? The labor code should be focused on 3 points only. It has to provide, first of all, not the exploitation. There should be certain guarantees of some rest, the work of the underaged, of the people with disabilities. It must give the guarantees of relaxation, the compensation for the overtime work, not more. The second, it has to include the guarantees of non-discrimination. And again, if we take the examples of the USA, about 90% of all of the arguments between the employers and employees are not because of the violation of the contract conditions, but because of the discrimination. I was fired because I'm already 48. And they didn't fire anyone who was younger than 40. This is an age discrimination. I was fired because I am a woman, and they just don't want the woman to work there. And this is discrimination. And again, in Ukraine, we can't say anything about that. And the third one, so not harmful conditions of work. So we are having the contract, our deal, how we are working, and we have the basic guarantees from the state in those 3 spheres. That all of the conditions of the contracts which contradict those things are not considered to be current. You can fire me because I work in the wrong way, because I work bad, and I, employer, I define what's the quality of the work. But I can't fire a person because I don't like his or her age, sex, color of skin, and so on. And the third problem we are having is influence of the trade unions. And again, this is inequality. Because the trade unions is the representatives of the hegemon today. Somehow the trade union doesn't have to give a consent with everything with their employer. It can do whatever it wants. But the employer has to take into consideration. And sometimes to prove something which to coordinate everything. And those trade unions are totally not accountable, they're not transparent, they are existing in some incomprehensible field. Did anyone try to get some financial report from the trade union? Some of the political parties are using trade unions as a tool to recruit people for the party. They say, we will create a community, and we will defend you, because you're lazy, maybe you won't do anything, but if you have us, the trade union, they won't fire you. Those are the 3 main parts that interfere us to function normally in Ukraine for the free economics, for everybody who wants to hire freely all of the workers, to make deals about the working relationships and to govern that, and not just to find whether you have the proper line in the catalog and the classificator of the posts what I need. And if I have any instructions how to organize this new work in the 21st century, when our state doesn't even know how the modern enterprise work functions, we must define the working place finally. It doesn't exist. It stops existing in this world now. And I can't fire a person if he is working in Lutsk. He's my sales representative and he doesn't have the working place. So I can't write down that he just missed one day. So I have to write the document that his working place is the car. And this nonsense is okay for the court. That's it. Thank you. Thank you, Dennis, for such a short and very understandable, comprehensible report of what we were speaking about during our meeting. So we decided to show the indicator of economic freedoms, which is the West in Ukraine, for 4 components: the size of the state, the money system, the law enforcement, and the labor market. I'm sorry that we took some time from the next topic, which would be very interesting, but still, we can answer the questions. Andrei, one question. Okay. One comment and one question. One comment, Dmytro, when you showed one of the first slides of your presentations, the size of the state in comparison with the neighbors. So you had Germany, France, nothing special and nothing particular, it seems, but you can see it in the index. It's a bit simplified approach. In fact, the size of the state has to be looked upon knowing the level of the economic development of the country. And you know, there is the Wagner law, when the size of the state depends on the level of economic dependent on GDP per capita. So there used to be Wagner who found this dependency. So knowing Russia and Ukraine, it would mean that the country with the lower level of economic development should need the smaller size of the state to have the similar tempo of the economic development in comparison of the more developed countries, that is Germany, Luxembourg, Canada, the US, having the higher size of the bigger size of the state and having the higher quality of the institutions. They still are able to preserve the tempos of economic growth. Still, for the countries of our level of development, this critical level of the size of the state is substantially lower. If it's interesting to you, I would recommend you the work where we analyzed the Wagner law and the law of the size of the population, which influences the size of the state, and we had a certain formula, a model, which allows to define the critical amount of the size of the size and the optimal size of the size to have the proper tempos of economic growth. So maybe if you did it before, you could see that the size of the Ukraine state look like German one, but still it's bigger burden for Ukraine than for Germany, for instance. And the question is as follows for Volodymyr, maybe, or maybe to the whole panel discussion, or maybe to the whole audience. Knowing what you were saying about the quality of the law enforcement bodies and the very bright example you've mentioned, what do you think? The quality of so-called law enforcement institutions in Ukraine now, during the recent 2 years, for instance, in comparison with the quality of the institutions during the Yanukovych time, did it become worse? I think that it's approximately the same phenomena. The other thing is that now Ukraine is in the state of undeclared war, and undeclared war doesn't help improvement of the transparency, accountability, and other factors. So in this case, Putin, with his attack on Ukraine, I'd say, helps to make the archaic institutions and to support archaic institutions in Ukraine. But my opinion is that we have already seen the 4th cadency of the president. It's a totally a separate politician and economic phenomenon, and if we speak with a simple language, we need to change the system. This is so far a simple answer for your complicated and interesting question. I'd like to add that, knowing the law enforcement, really some things have changed, something maybe even worsened, but the participants of our discussions mentioned that during the Yanukovych times, any state officials of any level, they could come and just claim money. But now, after Maidan, it has become more complicated, and it's more of the exemption than a rule. So, in fact, in this sense, there are certain improvements. But as for your comment, our draft has reflected that. One of our participants, just according to your words, he said, but can we have such a level of development like Germany has for us to have such taxes as Germany has? This is the right opinion, so consequently we are fighting for the cuts of the state in Ukraine. But unfortunately we have objective problems connected with the high share of the pension as retired people, military expenses, and the big share of the external debt. So in this radical way how we should cut the state, it won't work. But still we have some space to do, so I think for 7 and 8% of GDP is able to be cut, even rather quickly. Thank you. And again, I could appeal for the very simple formulas. The things which happened during the revolution, they were hidden, but then they regrouped. So this is just a usual thing. When somewhere it became improved, for instance, the epidemiology inspection became better, but still this monopoly for usage of force, it just flew to another place, and now some other institutions are leaders. But the quantity is the same. Maybe it's even better, because now you understand what to do. Because can you imagine that 5 years ago Volodymyr would have to create a presentation how to clean practically everything, all of the institutions and authorities, because it could gather money? At least now you can concentrate on something, but the volume is the same, and the people are the same, totally same people.